Welcome everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV, and for my members, SFO Continuity. As I might have mentioned in my last program, I have many more distribution channels now than ever before. So those of you that may be familiar with me on LinkedIn Live, don't forget my core platforms at Family Office and at Family Office TV are on YouTube. I also have a revamped and up and running Apple and Spotify for more traditional audio only, and even a Rumble account. So make sure to go to all of them and subscribe. On that note, today we're covering Wyoming. Finally, I've been looking to cover this forever, and probably more importantly, private trust companies. We're going to actually cover much more than that, all in relatively a short time frame, with a very special guest who I haven't seen in a long time, and finally, someone who legitimately is in Wyoming, not just like me in and out, but effectively all the time. Our special guest today is Laurent Roux. I've known Laurent since about my first days, many years ago, of forming Family Office Association. He's been wonderful as an intellect, a global source, a gentleman, and has been very cordial, and I appreciate his time. Laurent, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Angelo. It's an honor and it's a pleasure to be with you. I will pick up on what you just said, which is that we've actually known each other for more than 20 years.
You're making us feel like old men.
It's going to age us a little bit, but so be it. It's a pleasure to be here. I am sitting in Jackson Hole, and would you like me to introduce myself in any form or fashion?
I think that would be awesome. And for the audience, sometimes you're used to hearing me saying in Jackson Hole. I'm in Weston, Connecticut, right outside of New York City. Look to be in Jackson Hole for some time in September, but Laurent is actually there now. But I do think it would be helpful for the audience, Laurent, if you want to take maybe 1 minute and give a little context of your background.
So I am currently an independent director and member of the board of the Willow Street Group, which is a Wyoming trust company that was founded in 2004 and 5. The trust company itself has been established in 2017, and we have some 44 people here, Angelo and Jackson. We have some 217 families from around the world. PTCs are about half of what we do. Directed, delegated, trust, et cetera, are the other half. And we are sitting on substantial assets, 40 billion under administration, but no investment management. So we are fiduciaries, and we are not conflicted by that issue of asset gathering. My past history has been working in my family business, as you know, which was Pictet and Company out of Geneva for almost 28 years. I started life as an attorney. I'm not an attorney now, not a practicing attorney. And I have spent many, many years in the family office space, as you also know, which is how you and I actually got to know each other when you had the wisdom and the foresight to start the Family Office Association. So that would be the simple version.
That's wonderful, Laurent, and very helpful. I'm going to start. Cheyenne, Wyoming was at one time, for a very brief period, it could be debated, but at one time, the wealthiest town in the world. That year would be 1882, and that was primarily due to the boom in cattle and partially due to increased utilization. Again, anything is a product of supply and demand, and to some degree, even the advanced use of barbed wire. We won't bore the audience with some of the grand detail of it. You got to come to Wyoming for that. However, a terrible, wicked, even by Wyoming standards, but especially back then with more limited resources, winter destroyed a lot of effectively the cattle. I think the big picture that I'm trying to get to is you have family history of wealth and success going back over 500 years. And I think it's important for the audience to know, although maybe that specifically at the moment won't be a black swan event, there are things that could happen that could change everything and very quickly. How do we learn how to be resilient and adapt?
At the family level?
It's an open-ended question, any way that you want to take it.
Okay, well, so that's a good question. I think that it's very important for families to know who they are, where they come from, what their history is. That's the starting point. And if it's a family enterprise, same conversation. And what is the family culture? What keeps us together as a family? What matters to us as a family? How do we learn as a family? Where are we trying to go today and into the future as a family? So that's one consideration I would keep in mind. The second one is the complexity of families today is much broader, wider, more complicated than it's ever been. If you think about multicultural in-laws, if you think about the LGBT world, if you think about the wealth that's been generated in the last 2-3 generations, especially, there is much at the institutional level and the family level that has to be considered. So at the institutional level, in terms of the structural capital conversation, what is out there to help families organize themselves and consider the future? And the private trust company is one option. Now, we should also remember that trusts, revocable, irrevocable, directed, delegated trusts that have been the norms for many, many years are also still great vehicles, tools for family and beneficiaries. But there is a big difference between the PTC conversation and those trusts, which we can beat up a little bit if you like. And then the last point that I would share with you, Angelo, is that the affinity conversation, the meaning and purpose within the family, the values, the mission, all these kinds of things that we've been talking about for years now need to be considered by families and their attorneys when they actually think about their trust and estate planning. And one of the big challenges that families have, if we put ourselves in the shoes of our families, is to what extent is my legal person helping me think strategically and practically and transformationally over generations, as compared to purely on a transaction basis, i.e., let's do this this trust and estate plan and move on. And that's a big conversation that families have.
Indeed. And there's so much going on more broadly in the family office community. And I hope having enough time, we'll have a chance to get to some industry perspectives where we might even have some differences of opinion, but bringing up some points and potentially different ways of thinking to the community, I think is going to be good. But the core focus of today is what you noted. Right before that I get to that, I think I would be remiss, given all that I do on economics and the importance of it, to not note that you happen to be in the area right now where I wish I was there in mid to late August, where the Jackson Hole Economic Policy Symposium. So there's a lot going on and a lot of conversation and perhaps direction relative to interest rates, true inflation, and the impact, Jerome Powell, and of course, many others that are there. Is there a feeling around town in the community? Is there any insight that you could share with the audience?
Well, your question is one day early. And
It's
I'll tell you
close.
why.
Yes.
I'll tell you why. We have a lunch group composed of very, very interesting people here that meets every week. And the Kansas City Fed comes to visit with us at our lunch, which is tomorrow, ahead of the meeting. And we get to ask questions. And so that's when I'll be able to answer the question. But barring that, what I would share with you, Angelo, is that in the last couple of weeks, we've been overrun with political people and fundraising. And now we're changing the hat from that scope to the Fed meeting that you just described. Jerome Powell is going to speak on Friday. The main point that everyone's going to be watching for, listening, et cetera, is whether or not there's going to be 25 or 50 basis points of interest rate cut in September. And maybe there won't be, who knows? But this happens every year, and it's been going on, this meeting, from memory, I think it's over 30 years now.
Yeah, the early 90s. So maybe 30 years on the button, actually.
Yeah. So it's a very important meeting that I'm sure all your viewers know about because it does get a lot of press, and it does get many, many central bankers from around the world. So we are, maybe this is the answer to your question. We are being invaded now this week by a lot of very important people.
Yes, and you're correct relative to the luncheon you have going on tomorrow. Sorry, audience, I am like one day too early. Getting right to it, Wyoming is a very special state, not because we both love it and all the benefits that we think it provides uniquely as a state in our quote unquote United States of America. It's the first state, for the best of my recollection, back in the very late 70s, maybe 79, to have LLC legislation.
You're
And
correct.
I look a little deeper from chancery courts in Wyoming to certain trusts of other states decanting and coming to the state of Wyoming. And although it may be more perception than an actual reality, we could also talk a little bit about real common law jurisdictions, quote, quote, civil law, and comparative of the two.
Okay. So here's a thought. As your viewers probably know, there are a number of states that are what we call zero tax states, like South Dakota, Wyoming, Tennessee, and many of these states have introduced post 1991 with the Prudent Investor Act revisions that allowed for dynasty trusts and a abrogation of the rule against perpetuities. What that means is that the trusts that are formed in those jurisdictions can continue in perpetuity. They don't have a shelf life. So in the case of Wyoming, it's 1,000 years. In the case of South Dakota, there is none from memory. And these states that you've alluded to as common law states have adopted the Uniform Trust Code, as all 50 states have now. But they are a little different than Delaware. And the reason I bring up Delaware is because historically in America, Delaware was the state where trust and estate planning situs was considered key. And Delaware has some 300 years of legal history behind it. And it has a chancery court dedicated to trust law. That law is very sophisticated, and everyone respects it. So don't get me wrong on any of those points. But if you're a family and you want to have flexibility, you can look to other states such as Wyoming. And the reason we have a lot of flexibility is because we don't have a lot of this case law behind us on the one hand, but more importantly, the Uniform Trust Code, without that legal history behind it, enables families to have a fair amount of flexibility in what they would like to do, and at the control and the ownership level of their wealth. And that is the introduction to the private trust company conversation, if you will, because the private trust company is all about control and ownership.
And when I talk about my experiences traveling the world, knowing thousands of families and family offices, we've been talking about this for decades, Laurent. It's not a surprise that control, privacy, and customization would be the extreme advantage of a single family office. And that is going to come back to my conversation around a private trust company, a PTC, in my opinion, is the ultimate in coordination with a wealth management company, SFO, and if you're active in direct investments, in my opinion, a family holdco. And Wyoming is an excellent state in terms of the structuring and the internal coordination, even for offshore families, which we may not have enough time to get into today. So it's integral to dynastic planning. There's a level of privacy and the level of control. Let's talk for the audience that may be a little bit less familiar about me using acronyms like PTC and us throwing around private trust company, a little bit of a foundational understanding of what it is and then the value that it provides, Laurent.
Okay. Before we do that, I thought maybe I'd highlight a couple of bullet points around the state of Wyoming
Please.
that make it attractive to families. So by way of taxation, as I had mentioned before, there's no state income tax. For those that are involved in private placement life insurance, we have the lowest premium tax in the country. Modern trust law. So I talked about the rule against perpetuities. Directed trust statutes, trust protector statutes, just to name two. Reform, you alluded to decanting and the facility of decanting. To non-judicial settlement agreements, which is an agreement between beneficiaries without having to go through the court system. To the privacy laws that you alluded to, and then the regulated and unregulated aspect relative to trust companies, which protects the confidentiality and the privacy of family and family matters, are just a few of the great attributes, not to mention asset protection and creditor protection. So those are all assets that we have in this state. Now, if we drill down to the private trust company, the private trust company, again, as you alluded to, is founded upon the LLC legislation that we established many, many years ago in Wyoming. So the private trust company is an LLC established in Wyoming. The company itself is owned by a purpose trust. And the purpose trust has only one purpose, which is to hold the private trust company. And the purpose trust has no beneficiary. It has what we call an enforcer to make sure that's the case. Now, the private trust company itself, as an LLC, enables the family, as we said, to have control and ownership over its wealth. Now, how does it do that? It is administered by a board of managers. And the board of managers is usually an independent corporate trust company, such as Willow Street, which is dedicated to managing, administering the company. And the family can get involved in many different ways. But I think before we go there, we ought to remind ourselves that quite often the family that wants to consider a private trust company is a family that has a number of trusts, not one or two trusts, for example, on the one hand, that has a significant amount of wealth, and that is looking to the trustee beneficiary relationship on a long-term basis. And then lastly, they might be concerned with two things. Number one, well, let's step back. One key point. If you and I are trustees of a trust, what are we doing? We have all the legal risks and obligations as the trustee, right? And we are going to be very conservative and very cautious as to how we deal with the beneficiaries and the investments and anything else related to the administration of that trust. And then there's one other issue, which is called succession planning, because you and I might pass away at some point, hopefully not soon, but might happen. It will happen, right? Okay. So the family that is thinking about a private trust company, when they form that company, guess what? It lives in perpetuity. There is no individual succession plan risk. They don't need to care about finding a successor individual trustee, because the company will continue after their deaths and their heirs' deaths. So it's a very, very efficient tool, vehicle for a family that's considering its trust and estate planning.
And there are certain assets where corporate trustees generally keep away from. Isn't an advantage of a private trust company, besides the issue of control and it being a trustee of quote unquote assets, and we'll get to boards and committees within it in a second, but the importance of it could effectively be the trustee uniquely under, let's go with family control, of unique assets.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. And many families have the family business involved with the PTC and the family office. And you mentioned the single family office as a case in point earlier. And there is a collaborative exercise that occurs between the private trust company administrators and the single family office, or even a client that is in an MFO.
And correct me if I'm wrong, in a private trust company, sometimes a challenge for trustees, you hinted at it, is legal liability. Because it's structured as an entity, you are capable of getting directors and officers and other forms of protective insurance for the trustees.
Correct. And then there's one other, there's one other aspect that has arisen that we should allude to or discuss quickly, is that the famous unbundling conversation in the wealth management world. And by that I mean many families have been working with a single provider that is doing everything for them. And in the world in which we live, compliance has become a very big deal, as we all know. And one of the things that has troubled some families is that they would like to make certain investments that they cannot do with the single provider that they are working with, because that single provider will say to them, "We don't have a relationship with this firm or that firm." And so the family has some frustrations. And as a result, the private trust company that they own and control, which has an investment committee, allows them more flexibility in that realm. Now, it also presents greater risk, and they might make a good investment or a bad investment. But the bottom line is that they feel like they have more control over what's happening with the investment of their assets. And so that's been a motivator. And then there's another motivator for the private trust company, if you allow me quickly, which is some years ago, I worked with a family where there were 3 family members, 3 trusts, 4 trustees on each trust, the beneficiary, the father, and the mother, and an attorney who had a relationship with a big investment firm. And the 3 kids were meeting with the trustees once, maybe twice a year for an hour each. And they didn't feel like they had any kind of influence or control or idea of really what was going on with the assets. And the assets were some $250, $260 million between the 3 of them. So what the conversation that we had was built around the PTC, which is, if the 3 of you and your children, i.e. the cousins, want to have co-investments on the one hand at your level, the cousins working, living, existing together in the future, benefiting from these assets that you have, you might consider a private trust company. And they did that. Now, what's interesting is that they brought the trustee fees down from just about $450,000 to about $60,000 a year with this little exercise. And they gained the control and the ownership and the influence, and they're on the investment committee, and we built some governance around the private trust company. My point to the viewers is that there is much more to the private trust company than meets the eye.
Indeed, there is. And I don't know if we want to get super deep into the weeds, because there's nuances in each state and conditions change. And some of it is open to some level of gray area and interpretation. You said usually the private trust company is owned by a structured purpose trust.
Correct.
So there needs to be a settler and a trustee. Could it get new?
So to your point, the settlor will be the patriarch or the matriarch when they start doing their trust and estate planning. And then the purpose trust will only have one role and function in life, as I said earlier, which is to hold the PTC. And there will be someone called an enforcer, okay, who could be akin to a trust protector, who will oversee and make sure that that's the only thing that's happening.
And who are the trustees of either the purpose trust, or is it actually the PTC?
So that the purpose trust and the trustee of the purpose trust is itself. It only has one, it has no beneficiaries. It only has an enforcer. Its only role and function is to hold that PTC.
So could the settler be the person in charge, and if something negative were to happen to them, the protector steps in and changes it?
Well, the protector is the one who would do that, not the patriarch or the matriarch.
Okay.
There has to be a legal split between the owners and creating the trust and the trust company.
Is
And
there
that's,
any intertwining with a living trust per your experiences?
what do you mean? I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Well, that goes by different perspectives. And the purpose here of a PTC, you're correct, the purpose trust is really going to be most applicable. How does it intertwine? Because now you have the private trust company that, depending on structure, and we should get to regulated and unregulated very, very shortly, but is there going to be a board of directors? Is it consensus? How are decisions made that move forward?
Okay.
Does it vary?
All right. So here's the thing. Um, the board of managers of a private trust company can consist of people that are close to the family, the attorneys, the corporate owners. For example, in our case at Willow Street, we are the board of managers. It can be a family member who is not the settlor or the patriarch, but we always try to shy away from that situation to avoid conflicts of interest. So what becomes very important for the family is to make sure that whoever they're going to work with, there, to your point about affinity, there is a strong affinity with the people, the persons who are owning and running that trust company business. And one of the questions that we often get, which you've alluded to, is this. So all these jurisdictions look alike, and they all have the UTC, the Uniform Trust Code. How do I, as a family, differentiate where I want to go and who I want to work with? And at the end of the day, we would simply say to families, look, the law is very similar everywhere, with the exception maybe of Delaware, because there's a lot more of that history we alluded to some time ago. But what really matters is the firm, and is the firm aligned with you as a family in terms of what you're looking for? So, for example, if a family is looking for a rubber stamp, simple, I don't want to get involved with this PTC thing, I just wanted to have it set up and use it as a structure, and I'm going to let my family office or my private banker do everything else. I don't really care much about it. Okay, fine. Find a firm that does that you're happy to work with. On the other hand, some firms like ours are very keen on the relationship piece, knowing the family, knowing their history, what they're trying to achieve, what the future looks like, what the beneficiaries expect or hope to learn, and how is that going to work with us? And there are, we're only one firm, mind you, but that is a differentiator.
Could there be varying committees, investment committee, et cetera, just like a single family office that makes up and is under the auspice of the umbrella of the PTC?
Absolutely. So that is the key conversation relative to the use of a PTC by a family. So what committees are we talking about?
Governance?
So what are we talking about? Investment committee, education committee, distribution committee, governance nominating committee to the board of managers, for example, or the investment committee members. Most families will use the investment committee and the education committee as a way to help the rising gen crowd learn legal, financial matters. The distribution committee will not have and should not have a family member on it, because quite frankly, you've got a major conflict of interest if you have one family member who's dictating to the other 5, 10, or 12 family members what the distributions are going to be, not the mandatories, but the discretionary distributions. So family members not on a distribution committee, okay? But the investment education, the nominating governance committee, and what's interesting, and you just alluded to it, which is this thing of family governance that we always talk about and that many families have undertaken. The PTC, to be really functional, to be really strong today and into the future, if it does have a governance, is a great way to fly. And the families that have done this are very strong in terms of their communication process, in terms of their what's the word I'm looking for? Staying together being independent, but staying together as a family today and into the future, co-investments, you name it. It's very strong with that family governance piece.
Of course. And I think some outsiders may not understand in the world of the wealthy, where there's varying trust, meaning trustees, when there is family involved in the trustee, which often may disagree with others, could make sense, that does set itself up, depending on the family and communication, for the potential of intra-family litigation, which is ugly, which is expensive, takes a lot of time and energy, and defeats the purpose, you would hope, of unifying in governance in the family office. So the private trust company could be a very, very powerful governance vehicle. Laurent, when could I argue, and I've been on record a couple of times in my recent governance or family governance conversations saying there comes a point when it's too much, where it's overwhelming, it's hierarchical, it's overly bureaucratic, and it actually, in my opinion and my experiences, encourages fragility within the rising generation. When do you need enough governance, and when could it be too much?
That's a good question. I'm not quite sure how, there are a couple of ways to answer that, but let's start with this. The complexity of the family is the question that needs to be asked. So if you have a family that is pretty tight, that gets along well, that sees things today and into the future together, that has a good communication process, that is maybe, let's call it, very democratic, the way they function, they get along really well, to the family dynamics that you alluded to. You may not need today a lot of governance, whatever that governance means, okay, to help them function together and their beneficiaries, the future generations, to function together and to keep the wealth solid. On the other hand, if you have a very complex family with people with big family dynamics issues, that family is going to need to consider the extent of the governance that it might need. And quite frankly, sometimes they don't want that governance at all, no matter who they, which consultant they hire to work with them. But if they can get to a place where they can agree on some basic things, then that's good. To your point about too much bureaucracy, if it gets too formal and it gets too strict, then there's a risk that people take it for granted, become complacent, don't want to participate, et cetera. So each family has its own test or its own need. And the governance that one should build with the family, or that the family will build for itself, really, is going to depend on how complex that family is. I think that's the simple answer. And it's not an easy answer, but that's the simple answer.
No, this is 90% art and 10% science. You have the experience of being a significant dynastic family member and understanding history and lessons that you were taught that provides value to others moving forward. I as well have some unique experiences. For me, having investment committees can be cumbersome and hierarchical. Having outsiders of the family that have no skin in the game and no bloodline, in my opinion, making important financial decisions, often, in my opinion, disappointing relative to certain indices and relative to, in my opinion, how things are changing. I'm extremely hands-on. Now, I'm a relatively small family unit. I could state that I believe in an investment committee that's an odd number, like Buffett said, and it happens to be less than 3. That's going to make my life easy. Honestly, I'm probably going to make more money for the family that way. I'm just being honest. That's not probably going to teach my son proper governance for multiple family members growing into the family. And now, again, which is why this topic, in my opinion, is probably 90% art and 10% science. It's complicated. There is no one perfect answer.
So here's a thought. If you had a family with significant wealth, and what would that mean? Well, I don't know, let's say, 250 to $500 million. and they have a PTC, and they have that investment committee that you just alluded to. The investment committee isn't going to have like 9 or 12 or 15 people on it.
Sadly, sometimes they do, but that's rare.
They do. They do. They do.
It's sad. I'll agree with that.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you too. But here's my point. The goal of the investment committee in a family in that fact pattern would be there are beneficiary heirs that need to be part of or need to understand what it means to be a responsible owner of wealth, let's call it. And not a manager, but a responsible owner. So what does that mean? If we place the 18-year-old or the 22-year-old or even the 14-year-old in some cases into an investment committee so that they listen and they learn
and observe
what's going on, and they learn about financial education, okay? Keep it simple. It's age appropriate and all these other things we could talk about another time. But here's my point. I've seen several examples where the head of the investment committee allows the Rising Gen member to actually be part of all of the meetings with the investment managers. And what's happened over time is that those young people have then taken over the meetings from the investment committee person. And this happens a lot in the single family office space too, by the way, and then reports to the investment committee. So they have learned what it means to have oversight, to have risk management. They've learned what an IPS is, all these basic things that we all know about, and have become more responsible in terms of the investment piece.
Well, the rising education, getting capacity and capability coming down to skill set, the greatest threat to the family is the family. The greatest advantage to the family is the family. Engaging the rising generation, whether they like it or not, and I know I'm going to sound forceful, in basic principles of geopolitics, economics, and finance, to me is very, very important. I love that idea that you mentioned. To me, I would call that more of an observer, and maybe that grows into something more formal. But I think that's wonderful. The only part that I'm going to, and again, my audience who follows my content and my travels around the world, I'm a bit of an extreme advocate of my experiences, truly dynastic families that go back really far and engage the rising generations. I want you to disagree with me, Laurent, so don't think I'm looking for a commonality of opinion. They own, or they like to own and control private companies. When I hear the word institutional investors, I'm sorry. My mind goes to well-meaning, educated, often not bloodline, no skin in the game, overly traditional based on how things used to be. And they're not going to be as tactful or as quick in certain areas, let's even say AI. And it's been my experience. I like the family to be very, very involved in private companies. I know my method is very hands-on. I know it means rolling up the sleeves. I know it's much harder than being passive. In your experiences in Europe and America, where am I right and where do you think I might be wrong?
You mean in terms of the cultures or in terms of the families and their objectives and their goals? Where are you headed?
My experience is when I find families that go back 7 or more generations, they believe in gold, they believe in land, they believe in art, and they believe in private companies. Okay.
Well, I'm happy to disagree with you because that's what you wanted me to do. I can play that card. They also know that they have a responsibility as stewards of their family and the family wealth. And that stewardship conversation, some get it and some don't necessarily appreciate or respect what that means. But it also means that the plain vanilla investment world that you are pushing aside is part of the game plan. Now, think about the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. 6 or 7 years ago, the family decided that they were going to disinvest from fossil fuels, and they were going to reinvest in ESG, impact related, et cetera, et cetera. That is a significant change relative to family history, maybe not necessarily the governance, but in terms of where they were investing. And those investments can be private investments, like they could be some of the great ESG impact funds that are out there, et cetera. So there's a combination. So I don't totally agree with you that they just want to go to private companies. And quite frankly, the financial education piece in families that have been wealthy for many, many years are dependent on the governance that they've established, to the infamous conversation around, the Vanderbilt family versus the Rockefellers from the 1870s until today. And the Rockefellers are still here, and the Vanderbilts are all split up and don't have the same financial wealth that they did at the outset, that they inherited. So, that this is a bigger conversation, but I think that getting back to the private trust company, or even the family office world that we've all lived in, there is a great challenge to next rising generation members in terms of where and how they're going to learn a financial investment education. And then you could also throw in, the infamous family bank conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to do a startup. Okay, well, I'll give you the $50,000 and then repay it when you're done. Versus, okay, we'll consider as a family investing in your company, but we want a strategic plan, a business plan. You're going to report quarterly, and you're going to be reviewed just as any private venture cap, private equity deal that we do.
Yes, and I have a plan for an upcoming session with Warner, who you probably know, on that
Yeah.
subject of family bank. I kind of agree. I also think I go back to bureaucratic and hierarchical, and I think there could be some challenges with the option two, which sounds like the right option to go. And I agree, but I think it needs a little bit more, it's more nuanced. Back in terms of what I said earlier, to some degree, I'm a big advocate of the core satellite, meaning a core part of the portfolio, given the public markets have broadly done so good and there's so much exposure. What I'm mainly saying from passive is not necessarily no quote unquote public stocks. I question whether I need outside professionals to help me on it. If I'm ultra high net worth and I have my own family office with my own internal talent, and we develop our investment policy statement, our asset allocation strategy, I do believe the family needs to be hands-on in that process for a variety of reasons. I actually don't think we're as far apart as I may have made it out to be, but we could save.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but here's
Sure.
a thought. Here's a thought. Within that fact pattern, the fiduciary responsibility that the family has unto itself and its heirs, the risk management conversation, the monitoring of whatever investments they make are really key ingredients to that investment process. And so there has to be either somebody leading the charge in that office, or there has to be to the PTC, a committee of 3, doesn't have to be a committee of 30, to actually oversee that process, because the issue is a fiduciary responsibility issue.
You're assuming, depending on the size of the family and their relationship and communication, that may lead to being a problem. And to me, this gets to some of the bigger points as to why most families of great wealth, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. We could call it governance, but some of it is going to come down to investments and taxation and making bad decisions. To me, making bad decisions could include having a non-bloodline family member have too much control of the family capital and them being a relic of the past and not understanding the dynamic of how things are moving forward. I know this makes me an outsider in the community because my perspective is contrarian and different than most. I think having the discussion and hearing both perspectives allows everyone to kind of do their own research, think for themselves. But if we're not having varying opinions in the family office community, which relates a bit of maybe to some of our conversation later. We just have all groupthink. I think it's good that we disagree.
I'm thinking back to the late 90s, no, late 80s, early 90s. The Barings family in the UK and Baring Securities, and the fact that one of their people in Singapore blew up the firm and the family wealth. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, to your point, Angelo, the family was not directly involved in the management and the stewardship of the family assets, let's call them. I'm not 100% sure that that's completely factual, but I think that was the story. And that supports the case that you've just made. But, at the same time, the family members that are going to be part of the PTC or the SFO, et cetera, they really need to understand what stewardship means on the one hand, and they also need to understand fiduciary responsibility relative to the other family members. And not all family members who have those responsibilities necessarily appreciate those roles and functions. So
that is
the family
100%.
the family then better make sure that they put the right people in the right spot, in the right job.
To be fair, Laurent, and you were kind enough to bring up that example, I understand, audience, there's more than enough examples on the other side of family members making terrible decisions, arguably being too concentrated and being too much risk. So
the other thing I would add to these points,
please,
Angelo, is that we in the investment and consultancy and trust community are taking a real good look at the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves conversation, because many of us happen to believe that there are probably more success stories than failures. And that's a big conversation unto itself. And I'm not throwing it out there so we can debate it. I'm just saying that there may be some surprises in that space, because there are many great families in the world, as you know.
That is true. And some of the work of Dennis Jaffe and Jim Grudman bring up that fact that
Exactly.
Ratio after 3 generations of 92% significantly declined, maybe a little bit overblown. We could, depending on the families we interview and depending on the value of statistics and the narrative that we're potentially trying to push, I suppose we could each find enough statistics or research on one side to support our perspectives. Perhaps being anecdotal, you've traveled the world and met with families. I've traveled the world and met with families. You for probably a decade plus longer than me. I do understand that. These are things that I pick up from a variety of families at varying wealth levels around the world, but some commonality of challenges. In my opinion, when they become too passive in their legacy and in the wealth and the investing, it's going to trend down the negative path that may take decades to play out. But that's just what I see.
No, I agree with you. Passivity and too much affluence, complacency, those are killers.
Yes. Laurent, a very important question on private trust companies that I did not bring up, that would be specific to Wyoming and selectively only a few other states, is going to be, what is the difference between a regulated and an unregulated private trust company?
So the big difference is that the unregulated, the family and all its affairs remain private and confidential with the administration firm. A regulated, there are legal requirements financially, like a bond, a minimum capital. You have to have a meeting in Wyoming, it's every 2 years, I think, from memory, with the banking division and get audited. You're opening yourself up. And the reason you would do that, of course, is if you had non-family members that were interested in being part of the investment process, et cetera. But if you have an unregulated private trust company, all the matters, everything that happens is private and confidential. And of course, these days, the new CTA legislation that's going to come in on the 1st of January.
Corporate Transparency Act. Yes.
Exactly. Is going to have a bit of an impact on the LLC piece within this conversation. But at the end of the day, the unregulated is very flexible, And, you know, the other thing, and the other thing I'd share with you is that one of the attributes in Wyoming is, and I think you alluded to this earlier too, we have a chancery court in Wyoming now. And that is we see that as a big asset, because the chancery court means quite simply that you have judges dedicated to the trust and estate legal issues. That's been a big success factor for Delaware historically. And now that Wyoming has it, same thing. Now we have in Wyoming also a Wyoming Trust Association, which works with the legislature to enhance our trust law or our rules and regs. The legislature and the state is dedicated and committed to the trust space that we are discussing. So that is a huge, huge asset for us in the state.
Remind me, Laurent, do I have the option in Wyoming of going unregulated or regulated if that's what I wanted?
Yes, absolutely.
And that does make Wyoming and selectively one or two other states, per the best of my recollection, very, very unique. And I think we hear about regulated private trust companies. And for some families, that is going to be the right approach. I don't think we hear enough about the advantages, and you mentioned one significant one, of unregulated private trust companies. Now, what's been pounded in our head since I gets Dodd-Frank exception for single family offices to register is potentially, if they don't quite fit that profile, they're able to form a regulated private trust company, and they're potentially kind of going from, let's call it federal supervision with the SEC to state banking, which is likely going to be, rather bluntly, not quite as cumbersome and obtrusive.
Yeah, it's at a different level. Absolutely.
Now, I think what you would maybe argue.
But hold on, wait. I just had a quick one. Sorry to interrupt. The state of Wyoming is keeping a very close eye on what the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission promulgates relative to investment advisors and managers. And so if you are an RIA in the state of Wyoming, or you're going to be considering, a regulated trust company, et cetera, there are a number of things that are very similar to what comes out of Washington in this state. So this state has taken the regulation quite seriously.
I do hear some families, Angelo, if I have my varying assets are held in various structures, including trust and LLCs, all I really need is the trustee and governance structure of a private trust company. Why do I still need AKA management company, the family office? I think I brought this up with Tom Handler and other prominent attorneys. We, of course, all agree to ask that question is almost ridiculous. Of course, you still need a family office. But from your perspective, why or why not?
God, I wish I was in on that debate. I'll tell you why. It
wasn't much of a debate. We were kind of on the same page.
All right. Well, I would have debated it then.
Ooh.
There is a thing called a virtual family office. And the virtual family office is the utilization of a private trust company as the family office. And what the reason that virtual family office has arisen, if you will, not the reason, but one of the reasons is COVID. So families that had founder offices or that had small single family offices with, let's say, 3 to 10 people in it, got very frustrated, tired, whatever adjective verb you want to use, with the people management conversation and the bureaucracy that you alluded to earlier. And they either had a PTC and weren't using it for very much, or they decided to found a private family trust company and use that as their family office. The reason that can be done is that you have hired the administration firm to do, the taxes, the budgets, the accounting, the reporting, and all the rest of it in collaboration with CPA tax attorneys that are outside of the single family office anyway. And then you have the trust and estate plan that is built into the PTC. And the only real risk, if there is one at the end of the day, is the liaising of the different pieces of this little puzzle, which could be, for example, cyber risk. But at the same time, the efficiency of the private trust company is great in the sense that you don't have to manage these 3 to 8 people I alluded to earlier. And the administrating firm is managing its people on your behalf so that they serve you properly. And hopefully they're doing that job. And then the only thing missing really is the governance conversation. And you can build that governance, as we alluded to earlier, into that PTC. So why do I need a single family office in some cases? I might not. I could use that PTC as the family office.
Okay, Mr. Roux, now my gloves are coming off. I wish we had enough time to do a more formal debate, but I'll give a little bit of my rebuttal. First of all, I somewhat care less about efficiency and much more about effectiveness. I care about engaging my rising generation. I want them to be involved in economics and finance. They don't need to make it a career. They need to be more hands-on in the process. I am not an advocate, and I know this is going to make me sound old, and I'm technology proficient, and I'm someone who believes in upcoming within 10 years, we're going to have super intelligent AI, and everything that we know is going to change, everything. And I'm helping to prepare some families and family offices for that now. That's actually one of my big projects. But putting that aside, the whole concept of remote and virtual, to some degree, I think is partially bullshit. I completely agree with the recent comments of former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and with Elon Musk and others that basically have scratched their head and say, what is this virtual remote work stuff? Are there some people who are very disciplined and everything is correct in their operations and their systems where in certain times that can be effective? Yes. I do not think, broadly speaking, the remote and the virtual family office works. Am I an extremely hands-on person? Yes. Am I extremely believer in old school single family office that keeps it all under control and privacy? That's me. That's what I am. So maybe I'm cooking my own book. I'm eating my own cooking, whatever verbiage that you want to use. But there's elements of what you said that are not theoretically incorrect. I think it's worthy to have the discussion. I just vehemently disagree with part of it, Laurent.
Okay. So if I take the word virtual out of it, it might change your thinking a little bit, because virtual just is a simple way to say, you know what, it's similar, it's analogous to a single family office, this PTC thing that we're talking about and how it's structured and how it's run. And I have seen, not theory, I've seen and lived the practical of this family office structure within the as a PTC as compared to a standalone single family office.
For sub-billion-dollar families or for larger multi-billion?
Yes. No, for both. For both.
Okay. I want to learn more. I'm open-minded. I think I, broadly speaking, disagree with the premise for the reasons that I laid out. Is it possible to have, whether you call it remote or virtual, an excellent and effective family office? Well, part of that is qualitative more than quantitative. I suppose the answer must be yes. My experience is, especially post-COVID, going around with more people, well, our office is based in LA, but my talent is diversified around the world. I go there, and to me, they're just not as good. Maybe that's my perspective. Maybe I'm meeting with family offices that have problems, but I want to be a problem solver.
Here's the connection where you and I are going to come back together.
Okay.
From the pure family dynamics space space. If you think about the single family office CEO today as compared to 20 years ago or 40 years ago, that single family office CEO today has to be much more involved with family matters, succession, learning, all the things that we've been talking about during this call. You don't necessarily find that in this virtual PTC space. It is much harder to build that. So you have to have an advisor or a consultant or a protector that understands what the family is about and that's going to help it get through itself and its dynamics. And that is one of the challenges that the virtual family office has relative to a single family office. It's how do I manage some of these family dynamics? So if you are a firm like ours or others that are independent trustees, we have to make sure that the client relationship manager not only knows what the hell they're talking about, but appreciates what family dynamics are about, spots the issues, and then brings in someone to collaborate with them and work with the family. That's a bigger notion than just having somebody at the top who hopefully gets it. Now, you could argue that in a lot of single family offices, there are many CEOs who have no clue, also don't have a clue about the family matters and how they should deal with them. And so they'll hire, all of us that are in the consultancy space to help them work through it. But anyway, one of the potential weaknesses, I think, is there in the virtual family office conversation.
Well, of course, I'm going to agree, but I appreciate you bringing it up. I would say
I'm just trying to be fair and objective.
You're very fair. I guess I'm the one who's coming across as black and white and ardent. I don't know. The audience will let me know.
They will.
We have approximately about 10 minutes left, and we actually covered more on state of family offices earlier than I thought we were going to. But since that appears to be an interesting subject from my experiences and your global experiences, let's talk a little bit about that. So the statistics state that 2/3 of family offices have been created since 2000, and 2/3 of those 2/3 since 2019. The number of family offices defined as single family offices is believed to be about 11 to 13,000 internationally. It's an up and coming industry. You and I know that we could have spoke at a finance class at a university 20 years ago, and practically no one would know what the hell even broadly a family office is. Now that whole dynamic has changed. What do you think is both good and a challenge about the family office industry in its significant growth?
Okay, well, let's start with the label, family office. I wonder if that's the right label. I wonder if it should not be office of and for the family or some other phrase that enables the family to understand and appreciates what this entity is going to do with it, for it, by it. And so that's the first thought that I would share with you. The second thing would be, I had a conversation with one of my friends in Asia a couple of weeks ago around the commingling of family business assets and family wealth assets in a founder's office. Now, defining a founder's office would be the patriarch or the matriarch plus one or two of the children in the family, with the CPA and the attorneys on the outside. So it's a very small office. That office is going to be run, I would call it, by a seat of the pants approach. The discipline, the systemization, the functionality, the risk management is going to be way different than we alluded to the Rockefellers earlier, but I mean the big family offices that we've seen around the world that are very sophisticated in terms of how they function. Now, to your point, I'm going to reiterate the issue around the CEO and the extent to which that CEO has to be a different person than historical CEOs of family offices, because not originally, but even today, around the world, families will look at the financial aspect before they look at anything else. And we would plead the case, the necessity to do that, but also at an equal level, the family members, to our conversations about how they learn, what they need to learn, what's going to matter to help them in the future to be good citizens in the countries in which they live, et cetera. So there's a bigger conversation here.
A much bigger, and this goes back to some of the work of JU's from a founder's office to a true family office, and most of what we probably call broadly a single family office, which I will still hang on to that moniker, is probably effectively more of an investment office for a specific family.
Hmm.
Uh, and yes, I think it was Scott Pepette who wrote in FFI something to the effect of, 80-20-10. Effectively, the majority of family offices' time is dedicated to legal and financial matters. Maybe he was being optimistic. 10%, part of the third number of 10%, is really dedicated to family matters. Yet the greatest threat to the family is the family. How come there's not more focus on it? Do you believe it's gained some traction lately? Do you believe in the concept of a chief learning officer?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had big conversation. We actually have a group that Jay Hughes brought together a couple of years ago around the CLO, and the idea was to help define the role and the function of the chief learning officer and why that chief learning officer is important. So if you are in a single family office situation and you are the CEO, and let's say that Scott is correct and 80% of your time is on all of these legal, tax, fiscal, et cetera, structural matters, and you, even if you have an affinity to the issues of family dynamics and relationships and all the rest of it, and you can't spend enough time on it, the role and function of that chief learning officer in that family office is invaluable, because that person is going to be the guide on the journey, and they're going to educate on the one hand, they're going to share, but they're also going to listen, and they're going to learn how the people that they serve, the family members that they serve, learn, because that is actually the critical part of this conversation. Is someone needs to figure out, understand, respect how the members of a family learn and what issues each
Excellent.
of those individuals have. And the CLO is a person who can actually do that. And we have several family offices that have very strong CLO people in them that are doing great work. So yeah, your point is well taken.
I think it's an extremely underrated position, and
Yeah.
I'd like to hope will grow more and become more common moving forward. My last question, and relative to the issue of kind of state of family offices, this relates a little bit. Earlier this summer, I did a debate with a mutual acquaintance of ours, Jamie McLaughlin. Jamie
Oh
was
yeah.
a great guest, a great debate partner, and I think it was a interesting hour and 38-minute discussion. I'm overly simplifying it, and people should go back and listen to it and form their quote unquote their own opinion. But we had a difference of opinion, more so on what I would define as sub-billion-dollar single family offices. It would be too simplistic to say from his perspective, should they exist? But how are they going to be effective and efficient? My point was, most family offices, and admittingly, part of my perspective is qualitative, but some of it is quantitative. But this also comes from knowing thousands of family offices and knowing greatness in the few when I see it. Yes, most family offices, broadly speaking, even above a billion, are not necessarily optimized. But for a sub-billion-dollar family office, in my opinion, and apparently only Carol Pepper agrees with me, uh, it's not because of their it's not because they're too small. It's not because of outside forces. It's their own internal lack of proper governance, lack of culture, and lack of proper systems and operations. There's no reason why a far smaller single family office can't be very, very good. I totally disagree with the concept of outsourcing everything to Wall Street. We need to be big. We need to have 40 or 50 employees. That's layers and layers of management and waste that I absolutely feel is not needed.
Guess what? I would agree.
Oh my God, I'm shocked.
No,
This
you
is
shouldn't.
very rare, Laurent.
No, you shouldn't be. With my old Pictet hat on, in Europe and Asia, I worked with some very significant family offices. The biggest one had 66 people in it and 3 offices. When we were done, to your point about bureaucracy and all the rest of it, we had whittled it down to efficiency at 32 people. There was some outsourcing to us and others, et cetera. I won't get into that, but here's the thing. The family dynamics issues are inherent in all families. We've all got those issues, whether we want to admit it or not, they're out there, okay? The second thing, a family office, whether it's from the founder's office, the basic office that we alluded to earlier, to something very sophisticated, the issues are going to be the same. And as I mentioned, to the investment point, the founder's office, I would share with you that I believe there is a majority of them that don't have the systemization, the discipline to actually invest wisely, as compared to, I went to a cocktail party and spoke to my buddies and they did this and they did that, so I'm going to do the same thing kind of mentality. But I think all of the issues, all the consultancy issues that we deal with families, history, people, culture, et cetera, they're in all families and they're in all family offices. But remember this, each family has its own support, goals, mission, needs, et cetera. So does it have to be a single family office, or should they be with a private banking institution and be very happy, or should they be with a multifamily office that can work extremely well too? It really depends, I think, on the family and what their needs and their goals are, because a lot of families don't need, the whole infamous litany of family office services that we all prescribe. So no, I think that they apply to all these family offices.
Excellent points, Laurent. Although I may disagree with the latter comment, I do think every family office, or every family that is capable of forming a single family office, and we could debate what the AUM and what that could look like, the single family office is going to be the ultimate in control, privacy, and customization. But if you're not going to do it to be incredible, to be great, to be excellent, it's timely, it's going to take energy and money. And honestly, most of you don't do a great job with it. So could I make the point that the other options, you mentioned private banking or an MFO, could be good? I would like to say yes, but I feel sadly many of them are subpar as well. And I see many, many weaknesses there. But why don't we save that discussion for a part two? Ending on a partial tongue-in-cheek note, because I get this question. Angelo, I love Jackson Hole. Yellowstone's awesome. What is underrated other than those two that people that aren't familiar with the great state of Wyoming would benefit from either visiting or knowing about?
Oh, that's an
Devil's Tower.
Devil's Tower is very neat. The family that owns the ranch and the campground and the amenities, everything around it, are good friends of ours. They've been there since 1883, case in point.
That year comes up again.
Yeah, absolutely. Visiting Sheridan, learning about the history of horses in this country. All the horses for the U.S. cavalry in the 1800s and into the First World War came out of the Absaroka Range, which starts in Sheridan and goes south through the state. Dude ranching. If you have a family and you want to spend 3 days or a week on a dude ranch, riding horses, eating really well, being outdoors, living in a log cabin, et cetera, that is a fantastic experience. In Jackson, we have a thing called the Snake River. Remember that? And the Snake River has great fly fishing in it. It has great rapids in it. The biking, the climbing, the hiking, the skiing. I mean, I could go on. But you're really going to laugh. You're going to really love this one, Angelo. When we have lots of visitors come through Jackson, and they all have a great time, and they say, "Oh yeah, we want to come back," et cetera. What I always say to them is, you know what? When you go home, don't tell them where you've been.
That is so true, because part of the charm is it's the least populated state in the U.S. and it's a big state geographic wise. And I'm going to throw me in there too, because I'm partially there. We like it that way, everyone. But if you want to come visit and spend money in our state, it's okay. Just maybe, like you said, you don't need to tell everyone. Laurent, this conversation was engaging. I appreciate that we went down some directions where we disagreed and we were able to have a civil discussion. You would think that that shouldn't be a hard thing, but we look at politics today and note how challenging that is. And the sad reality is in the family office world, there is too much groupthink. There is too much vanilla, although vanilla happens to be my favorite ice cream. And there's not enough open discord that's intellectual on disagreement. And I appreciate you coming on and us having a great discussion. For those that would like to learn more about you and the private trust company, how could they learn more and how could they reach you?
Well, they can go to LinkedIn. That might be the easiest place to start. They can look up willowstreetgroup.com. They can look up gallatinwealthmanagement.com. And then they can just put my name out there, and hopefully the deep fake won't exist and the good stuff will dominate. But look, I'm grateful, Angelo, for you having asked me to do this with you. It's been fun. We've done some great things in the past for families at FOA when we did the private family day or afternoon sessions, the private sessions. And I think the families loved those when we did them. I think that you drawing attention to the private trust company conversation is very important because it is a fantastic vehicle for families in terms of their trust and estate planning. And they really should take a second look if they've never, or even a first look if they've never taken one. And then lastly, it's been a pleasure.
Well, that's very kind. My closing comments, first of all, absolutely follow Laurent, reach out to him, learn about the companies and learn about private trust companies. Laurent is spelled Laurent and Roux is spelled Roux. Pretty simple. I appreciate Laurent as being a friend and supporter since my earliest years in the community. I learned so much from him. I'm great to have a wonderful network of incredible people around me. We all know I'm an imperfect person. I've been humbled multiple times. I'm very fortunate I hope to be resilient. And I've been very fortunate in the successes that I've had in my career. And Laurent has always stood by me and has been a friend. I appreciate that. For those of you that enjoy the conversation, again, I have a tremendous amount of content, often on geopolitics, on economics, on investing, and on direct family office issues. But even the other three, I always bring back around the families of great wealth and single family offices. At minimal, LinkedIn and my two YouTubes, at Family Office and at Family Office TV, to learn more about me and some of my membership programs where there's exclusive benefits, including over 30 in-person events, primarily New York, Palm Beach, but also Jackson Hole, LA, and on my once annual trip to Europe. Simply go to angelorobles.com and learn more. And Laurent is reminding me the couple of consulting assignments I do, usually for families and family offices, I may need to make it mandatory that you're going to have to join me at the Four Seasons in Jackson Hole. I don't know if you're going to want to go there in January or February, but I guarantee you, if you get there, it'll be worth it. And it'll be a very captivating audience because with maybe 3 feet of snow outside, you ain't going anywhere. You're going to be locked in with me for 3 days, as interesting as that may be, both good or bad. But on that note, everyone, I appreciate Laurent. Thank all of you for viewing and watching. Have a chance to reach out to both of us. We both appreciate you. Thank you so much. And thanks again, Laurent. My